So we're going to continue the exploration, I guess, of Python and Django and that world of development. It's becoming, as we've noted somewhere along the way, it's becoming a very popular language. Actually, if you look at, which is not exactly a perfect measure, but if you look at questions on some of the primary sites that you would go to for learning about a language such as Python and Django and stuff like that, the number of questions that are showing up that are Python related is just blowing away all the other languages are out there. You see things you would expect, like there's a steady decline of C++. R is another one that just has been growing for a few years, but that's very niche. You've seen, and I can't remember, I think it's like a little bit of growth in Java, a little bit of growth in C#. You've seen JavaScript has grown up, and some of these other like COBOL and stuff like that has gone to about a 0. So if that's any kind of an indicator, then Python is definitely going to be one of those languages you're going to need to be at least comfortable with, moving forward. This presentation, I want to focus on, we're getting actually into, and we're sort of stepping back from the Django side because that's really the web interface piece. And we're going to look at Flask, which has a lot of stuff that it can provide, but we're going to specifically look at how we can use it to create a RESTful API framework quickly in the world of Python. So we're going to do a quick overview of Flask, look at some common usages for it, and then we're going to dive right into creating an API, adding to our API, and talk a little bit about the authentication and security related to that. So Flask is a framework. You can go see it. There's a link if you ever want to take a look at it, flask.palletsprojects.com. Or just if you Google Flask, then you can go, or Flask and Python, something along those lines, and you'll be able to see lots of results related to it. The value it has is it is very simple to use. It's very lightweight, and it's built for you to extend it, which is part of why Flask is so popular, because they call it a micro framework, and I think this is the first time I've seen that really used, but it does make sense. It's what I think a lot of us have gotten away from. If you go back years, maybe now decades, there were frameworks out there that did not. There wasn't a whole necessarily as much that they provided, but they were also lightweight. You didn't have a whole lot of stuff you had to install. You didn't suddenly blow up the size of your project from a couple kilobytes to multiple meg. And there are very valuable frameworks out there that we know that are not lightweight. Like Spring can do all kinds of stuff, but if you start rolling in a lot of Spring stuff, there's a lot of code that's underneath the covers there. There's a lot of stuff that you're pulling into it. And you look at Microsoft's always been famous. The .NET framework is anything but lightweight. There's a lot of functionality there, but I think a lot of these, they almost try to do too much. Flask is one of those things that says, hey, we've got a couple of key things we want to do. We want to provide you and let you extend on top of it as you need. So you can keep it very lightweight and thin, or you can start building out heavier stuff. And there's a market for that as well. There's people that have built extensions that do add that heavier amount of functionality that you may want. And it's part of this. There are limited integrations that are built in to Flask. This isn't something that's going to provide all of your needs, but because of that, it's also highly flexible. You can go integrate to what you need to. You can do what you need to with it, and it provides you really almost like the bare metal pieces of it that normally you wouldn't even want to deal with, anyways. So it allows you to use it as and where it's needed. There's some of the most common uses of Flask is to add an integration API to an existing application. And specifically, I'm looking at the Flask API piece. You can take an existing application like the one, and which is really the example we're going to see here today, where you suddenly need to, or maybe not suddenly, but you have a need to maybe provide an external interface, either for other applications you want to integrate with it, or vendors or customers or something at that end. As a back end for mobile devices, I've seen a lot of situations where you have mobile apps that were written in React or Angular, and Python Flask was used as the back end. So it was just straight API calls. And also, if you want something, as a lot of stuff that we've seen with Python and Django and now Flask, if you want to create a minimally viable product, if you want to do a prototype or a proof of concept, this is exactly the kind of stuff you want. You don't need all kinds of bells and whistles. You don't need to over-architect anything. You just need to do, a simple framework so you can focus on the problem that you want to solve. So this gives you a really nice foundation that you can grow on, and you can grow it and make it what you need. So we're going to do our first Flask app. The Flask library is actually loaded through pip. We've talked about that before. That is the Python installation tool, much like you would see Ruby, where they pull in gems, or Java if you're using like a Maven or Groovy or something like that. And we're going to create a little Flask app. We're going to look at some API endpoints, and then I don't think we've talked about this before, so we're going to talk a little bit about exceptions in Python, because that's going to allow our app to be a little more useful. So let's flip over. So I want to go first, I'm going to go right into some code. So when you want to, let's go, actually, let me flip back to that real quick before I go into the code. If you want to install Flask, then really it's just pip3 install Flask. And boom, it's going to load up your stuff. It's very simple. You don't have to do a whole lot to add it into your application. I've got a lot of extra stuff here, but really, you just need to worry about initially this. I actually imported that twice, so I don't need that. Let's push this up here to the top. Really what you need is you just need to pull this thing from the Flask library. You're going to import Flask, and then you're going to be able to go off and running. And this is for the API, because Flask, I'm going to give it an app. I'm going to create a Flask app, which is basically my API application. I've got a little database connection thing that we've seen this before, so I can connect to a database. And let's just work with the most simple. So I could take all the code that's in here and reduce it to this guy, basically just the import Flask. And then this line, these 3 lines of code, actually it's 4 because it's a comment. And the way Flask works is I give it app, which is I created this thing called app, which is the API base. And then I give it a route, so the slash, and then I just say, okay, for this route, this is what I'm going to do. So if I go to that route, let's see, so if I go over here to Postman, and I do a get, let me do that. And this happens to be when I run it, let's go back to the code real quick. So right up here, so I'm just running this through Python, and let me do this. So I run this script. It's just a little executable script, and boom, now I'm running the API. It tells me where it's running, which is what I'm going to do here in a second. And I've got this in the development version. There's some settings in that we're not going to mess with at this point. So this is just getting you started quickly. So now back to my code. Let's see what happens if I just go to a route of 0, and I'll use Postman for this one. So I'm just going right to that route. And then here's what it returns back to me here's my little hello world. And that's all I did, is I just said return hello world. Now, I can also do 404s. So I can come in and let's do something weird here. And if I do that, then, okay, so we're going to switch over a little bit here. We'll go to this instead of Postman. I need to do a change to, make sure I get this right. Whoop. Okay, so we're going to switch over here because Postman can be a little bit of a pain to see. So if we go here, so we're going to go back on this. I'm just using curl to do gets as opposed to Postman. And you should be able to see down here, if I do the straight get that we did, here's my little hello world. If I do the same thing and I give it some sort of a bad address, now I'm coming back and I'm getting this JSON error endpoint not found. And the way I built that is Flask includes this make response. Actually, there's a couple things that are built into this. I can send a response back, and I can also JSONify something. So I can take a string, which is exactly what I did, and turn it into JSON, which was this error endpoint not found, which you see here. And you also see, because I'm sending a response back, I give it a code. In this case, I get it a 404. And I'm going to see here, this is a response that was sent back. So you can use your standards, 404s, 401, 400s, 200s, whatever it is, and build a custom response back based on your API. So in this case, I've got, I've built out a base of, hey, here's a hello world, that you got to this API. Or I could maybe say it like, so API connection successful. And oops, actually, I don't have that. I'm not on the right. That's not live code. Let me go over here. So if I go to here, and let's change that to API connection successful, then I am going to not see. So if I do it right now and call it, I still get my hello world, because this, unlike some other things we've done, does not reload it. So once I've run it, it's running, it's in memory. It's not going to do something. It's not going to check that I changed the source file. So I have to reload it. And then if I call it, now I'm going to see that I get my API connection successful. Or if I wanted to get really fun, then I can actually do it here. I'm going to go make that. I'm going to make that my message. And I'm going to make a nice clean API call. Call that success. And if I go over here and restart my API, let's do this. And now I see where I get my 200 and I get my mistyped connection successful. So they're literally in a matter of minutes, because I could have, I could easily have coded these couple of lines in. I can have an API up in a matter of minutes, and I can do some, some very simple stuff. So I could actually have an API that I'm, without even connecting to a database, I've got something that I can do pretty much whatever I need to. So I have an API where I can do all kinds of calculations. But of course, let's make it a little more interesting. So now, instead of just data that I've created on the fly, let's actually connect it out to a database. So we've seen this before. We sort of blew through it, but we have seen before where I've got this database connection. So now I've got here, if I go in and import the MySQL library that's already configured in Python, and then I can, I'm going to connect to pull in the error as well. Ooh, let me flip over to this where it's a little easier to read. So here, I'm going to add another route. I'm going to add feeds, and I'm going to connect to my database, which is basically connect to the database, get a little cursor that I can work with. And then we go in and create a query. So I'm just going to select from this table, and I'm going to execute the query. I'm going to fetch all the rows, and then, which is not uncommon to see something like this. And now I'm going to turn around and I'm just going to make a response, a 200 response, and JSONify those rows. Now, if I do that, so all I did was, it's a get, correct? It is, yeah. So I'm going to come through and I'm just going to do a get on feeds. And so I can see here that I've got this big JSONified things. If I take that same thing and let's go to let's go to this guy, go to like a Chrome. I can make that call, or I could probably do it in somewhere that's a little better. I could come in and change that if I want. Well, I'm not gonna mess with too much. So you see where this is JSONified is I've just pulled these records back. And you can see, since it's a select star, you can see, where is the first? Oh, here we go. So at JSONify, you can see where the brackets, so here's record 1, here's the second record, somewhere around here is going to be the third record. And I've very quickly, again, really within a matter of minutes, you can have something that's run up, and at least, much like we did with Django, where we had something that we could look at to quickly have essentially a CRUD interface for manipulating some of the data within our tables. I've, within a very short period of time, been able to build something so that I've got an API can actually provide external use and access to my data. Now, if I want to, and this error here, let me go in and I'm going to change that here. So let me change that to a table name that doesn't exist so that I get because I'm going to get a SQL error this time. And if I reload it, and call it. So now I got a failure executing that. And I've got a nice little error message that I can work with. Well, let's go over this guy. Let me fix that first. And then let me go over to this one. So what I did here, and this just sort of to reiterate, is so I did it. We have a try catch block or a try exception, as you've seen in many other languages. So what we're doing here is we're going to say, I'm going to try this command. And if there's any exception that's raised, then I'm going to grab this error, which I happen to import here because it's a MySQL error. So I'm doing it here, and I'm going to grab that error, which would be thrown by probably by the fetch all, because that's a MySQL. It's going to pass that exception up the stack. And I say, okay, well, I'm going to create this message. I think we've seen this before where I can go in and I can actually add parameters into the string, format it, and it basically says take this item, which is item 0, and places it here. Take this guy, which is in position 1, put it here. And then I just go in and I'm going to make a response. This time I'm going to call it a 500 error. I'm going to say you got an error, and I'm going to display that message. And so that's exactly what we saw here. Is I got a 500. I said, and I'm passing back this JSON message that then can be parsed out pretty easily to say, hey, I've got an error, and here's what the message is that error displays. So I could quickly generate errors of varying sorts. I could go in here, and let's just say I wanted to add a route real quick for error, just to test that it's, what would an error look like? And it says this. Let's say my errors are all going to be 500s. And say this is a generic error. I can save that. I can go back. I can reload my API. Whoop, I have a typo somewhere. Let's go back and look at that guy real quick. App route error. Oops, I have to change. Oh, that's. So I'm going to change my function name because that's using that annotation. It says the next function is going to. That's what it's going to call. So I've got to. These are actual functions, which means they have to be unique names. So let's get back to that. Let's run that guy. And if I go over here and I call error that I just created, then boom, I'm seeing that generic error and I'm getting my error code back. So at this point, I've very quickly been able to start putting together an API. I have a very, for the most part, a rather, it's I guess, general and basic at this point, but we're going to be able to expand on that. So let's look into some more things that you would think about when you're creating an API. Well, the first thing is, although we haven't really, it's been sort of suggested, but we haven't really talked about the fact that you can do lots of stuff with APIs. You can do gets, you can do posts, you can do puts, you can do deletes, and there's a whole bunch of, several other API options that you can do. And that's what we're going to be able to build out here, is that we're going to be able to do a get, a post. And we've done gets to this point, which is the default if you create something, which I'll show you that again when we look at the code real quick here. But then you can also do options, so you can figure out what is it that's available by any given API call. Which is a standard thing that you would want. If you've got an API call like API/my function, one of the things you want to be able to do as a user of the API is to say, well, what's available for that my function? Can I do a get? Can I do a post? Can I do a put? What can I do? And that's what options provides you. We'll take a look at that and how that is supported as part of the Flask system. And we're there are multiple methods that you can use to handle a call, or you can have a single handler. So you may have multiple API files set up. You may want to do one massive thing that checks whether it's a get or a post. We're going to take a look at some examples of that. That's much easier to show in the code than it is to, to sort of talk through in a generic sense. And then we're going to talk about some of the parameters and order and types and things like that you're typically going to set up within an API. And that is things like you want your API to have a look and feel that it's consistent. So if I have, method 1 and method 2, and I have parameters that are common, let's say it's an ID and a description. Well, method 1, the parameters should be ordered, from an order point of view, ID and then description, or whatever you do in that one, that should be the next one. So if you use ID and description in one, then when you go to function 2, use ID and description in that same order for the second one. And I'm sort of going over some of these things, assuming that you've got general API creation knowledge. And also, Flask does a lot of stuff for you. So it's things that I think you can, even if you aren't comfortable with doing this, if you haven't built an API before, it allows you some ways to quickly play around with what you're building and build an API that is useful to you and your needs for whatever your given application is. So as I said, it's, I think, easiest to dive right back into the code. Now, first thing I want to talk about is we talked about gets and posts and puts and things like that. And we've noted that everything at this point, there's nothing here. We put this thing together. There's nothing that says what that is. By default, it's a get. Now we can add methods. So I can come in and create this new one. So we had feeds before. Well, let me create a post to feed. Or I'm going to create another route called feed, and it's going to do a post. So now if I do a get on feed, if I do a get on feed, because here I'm specifying this is a get. If I do a get on feed, then I get this guy here. The method is not allowed for the requested URL. However, I do from that, I get options here. It actually is going to spit that out. That's part of what Flask is just going to give me from the start. Or I can do, if I say, well, what is available? I can do options, and it's going to tell me this thing supports put, delete, and post. Well, does it? Well, actually, if we look at this feed, we see here where it has a method for post. Here we have the same one. It has a method for put. And here it has a method for delete. So we do have all of those that are supported right now. And if I wanted to go in and remove one, so let's get rid of delete. If I just get rid of that guy and then reload and call my options, now we see that delete is no longer in there. So it's looking at, it's examining the API and saying what's available. So let's play around with this thing a little bit. Now, the first thing I talked about that I said is easier to see in the code is that you can create a single method to handle a route. So what I could do is I could have feed, and I could give it the methods of post, put, and let's say delete. And then within this code, I could check what kind of the call, if it mattered, I could say, well, which of these am I getting? And based on those, code accordingly. Or I can do it as I did here, which is a little easier to read. I think in this case, at least, is that I can see that, okay, I've got, and it's easier to maintain because now I can see that I've got a post, and I'm going to call update feed. If I get a put, I'm going to call create feed. And if I get a delete, I'm going to call remove feed. And so I've split up each of the methods of getting to this route, of getting to this endpoint, and I have a separate, separate function for each of those. Now in this case, we'll start with the post, because what I'm doing for a post is I'm going to say I'm going to be able to update one of those feeds, and we saw that in the get feeds, where we bring these three back. So we've got these three things that we've got. That actually, I guess we've got four of them here, because the last one was this test. So within this, now with posts, I'm going to say post is going to do my update, which is sort of a standard, at least in the ones I've run into. Typically, post is your update, put is going to create, is like an insert. It's not a hard and fast necessarily that it has to do that, but that tends to be sort of the approach that is taken. And so if I want to update one, that means that I'm going to have to enter an ID. I'm going to have to enter a title, description, URL. Now, what I didn't do in this test is I'm not actually going to change the database. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a pass-through at this point. So I am going to require some data to be sent across, which we're going to see here, to do that update. I mean, if an update without data is useless. Like, what do I update? What do I update it with? So in this case, I'm going to say, hey, I need to have some JSON included with this request, and I need to have a value of title somewhere in there. Otherwise, this isn't going to work for me. So if I do a post, let's do it this way. Let's jump back this way. So if I come up here and do a post to feed, and I don't give it any other data, then I'm going to get this 500. I'm going to say, hey, we can't complete this. We're not getting, this is not a valid set of data. In this case, let me go change this up just a little bit. Let me go to the full one, and I'll start playing around with this a little bit. So now let me actually give it some content, but I'm not going to give it a title. Am I running it? Oh, I missed something here. Oh, I'm not sending that back. Oopsie. Yeah, I did an abort. I'm sorry. It's an abort as opposed to, which is what I should do. Oh. Let me do that. Let me do a make response. Let's do that at 400. And let's do error. And we'll do that message real quick. So message equals title is required. And let me put this over here. So if I go here, well, let's do, yeah, so that was that whole route. Oops, save it. Reload it. And I missed something. Oh, put that in the wrong place. It was this post. So I want, there we go. So now if I go back over here, let's see. All right, I'm not kicking out my error the way I wanted to. Oh, that's why. I don't know why I have that. Oh, wrong file. That's my problem. Okay, sorry. Now I call this, I didn't give it a title. I return back bad request and I give it an error and a title is required. If I go through the whole thing, let's actually just do it this way, and I give it a title, then I'm coming through here and I'm going to say, so that's if I don't, then I send the error. If I do, if their title is there, then I'm going to create this little feed object, which is basically just spitting out what was sent. So I go into the request JSON, which you can see pretty easily. I'm going to grab the title. I'm going to grab that. I'm going to do a get of the description and default it to empty. If one's not there, that's what this get does. And whatever the URL is, I'm going to create that, assign it to URL. And then I'm going to update a record, and you're going to see the feed. I'm going to display whatever the feed is, which is this guy right here. And we see it. Let me push that up a little more into the middle of the screen. But we can see here, so I came through and I sent the feed and the message. Message was updated a record. And I took this is a test from the description, the test feed from the title, and the URL from the URL. Now, I could obviously do something more complicated. I could have actually updated the record. I could create the query like I did here and do an update, or I can do whatever else I need to do. So that's in my post. Now, if I turn around and instead send it as a put, so exact same thing, but now I'm saying, hey, this is a put. Then I still get my 201 here with the put. I get my 201 that was successful. But here, instead of where before I was updating a record, this time I'm inserting a record. And again, I've been able to do this very quickly by just adding a method function to handle another method on that endpoint. Now, if I want to do the same thing, I can do a delete. Now, delete, all I need is an ID. So let's say if I try to do that same thing and I do a delete, we're going to see that I'm going to run into an error. So I need, at this point around, I need authentication is required, which we're going to talk about here in a second. So let me change that. Start this guy. And so now, because I didn't give it the data it needed, it blows up. Comes up over here. It's going to give me some information, say that a board is not defined, which is fine. Let's just do it that way. Now let me go to the bigger code here. Now the problem with that is that I don't have an ID. So let me go back and do that same thing where I had title was required. I'll fix that and say an ID is required. If I fix that, run it. Now see, an ID is required. So if I give it an ID, here, now I'm giving it an ID, which you see right here, 42. Then it tells me, hey, I deleted record 42. Again, so we should be able to, hopefully you're seeing that very quickly I can create a response and I can either do a response, I can do some work and I can either send something back that is a success, or I can go through and send back an error message, such as I did here. Let me move that so it's a little easier to see. Or I can create a message and send back an error if I wanted to go that route. So I can send my codes back. I can send data back. And of course, this is where we see it very valuable from a mobile point of view. If a mobile application makes a call and I get this JSON message back, then it's very easy for me. I can tell what was the response code that I got. And then based on that, I can go out and probably fairly quickly parse my JSON and say, oh, hey, I've got a message. Let's display that to my end user. And essentially, we're off and running at that point. Let me do this real quick. And let's go back and do a little bit more. So one of the things you want to do is secure your API. You've got all these things that you've got this hook into your application that now the external world can mess with. Well, the next step is I want to be able to secure that. I want to be able to make sure that people that only authenticated users can do so. Flask has actually, we talked early on about how it's extended. And it's easy to extend, and a lot of people do extend it. There are actually multiple ways you can that are already out there. There are extensions that are security that are easy to use, and varying levels of granularity. Basically, some are very complex and high in security. Some are very simple. By default, Flask is going to use a token-based approach. So you log in, you get a token, and then you pass that token back as part of your authentication to say, hey, I'm authenticated. There's a lightweight library that we're going to use for our examples, which is this pip install flask-http auth. Gives you the Flask HTTP auth is the framework. We can install that just as we saw. It's seconds basically to add that framework into your system, and then you're going to be able to import that. It's easy to set up and use. You've got a login required that we're going to show to be able to secure it. We've already sort of seen this in action. It's not granular. So this is basically either you have access or you don't. This one's not, we're not setting this up with, for example, roles or permissions where you would have maybe an admin user that's authenticated versus or maybe just a user that's authenticated only to see certain values, or a role that's only allowed certain access to certain parts of the API. There may be, for example, you have an API where you've got customer information is part of it. So you would want to have that customer information only released to certain users as opposed to the overall. And of course, you might also have some things that it's fine to have it open to the world. So whether maybe the API, where the API is up and running would be something that you wouldn't want to secure, but there's other ones that you would. So let's get back to that. Let's get back to that code. And so I talked about the security is very simple. And that's what we do. We pulled in this Flask HTTP auth, and to generally get it turned on, we import basic auth, and we have auth equals. We have an auth, so we've got this variable that we're going to create that sets up that your default object for that. Now, if we jump down here, in order to use it, we've actually already sort of seen this. Is all we need to do from a general point is we just add this auth.login required. This tells me that I have to have a login in order to access this API call. And we saw that before. This was with that delete. We called it the first time around. Oops, I have to reload it. And I get an unauthorized access because I didn't do anything. I didn't log in. I'm not logged into this. So in order to do that, I have to give a way to this login required. Well, okay, I've got to be able to log in. And so we do that through getting a password, or actually it's the get password is the call. I'm going to call it get password. I'm going to give it a username. And what I'm going to do on this case is I'm just going to come through and say, hey, I need to return a password that is, it's going to have to match that. So if I get the right password, then that's going to be authorized. So if I come through here and so this gives me my authorization steps. So now I'm also going to pass a username and a password. And it's going to say, hey, if the password's right, given that one, then I'm going to be able to authorize it. And if not, then I'm not going to authorize it. So if I give my username with that Python password I set up, then boom, now I'm able to run it. If I give it the wrong password, then it's not matching up. So in this situation, now this is not that, like I said, it's sort of simplistic because now I'm essentially sending a username and password each time I make the call. But I can also do that through a token, so I could verify it via a token, which we'll explore in later sessions because I didn't want to get too deep into the security world, particularly because this one is a very simple and straightforward one. So now I've gone in and as we see, if I'm unauthorized, I've got this little error handler that I've created that says unauthorized access. I could also say please tag the admin. Oop. I want to put that over here so I can create my custom response. I can do all kinds of things. I can do redirects. I can do stuff like that. But at this point, we're going to keep it simple. And if I come in, then it just says, hey, please contact the admin. So once again, from a security point of view, I have, let's see. So through a security point of view, I basically just need to do, say the login is required to secure something. So now if I go back to any one of these, if I wanted to go back to, like, for example, my list of feeds, if I add that, then now I'm going to have to send a password, a username and password. I've got to authenticate before I do that. And now I'm doing login required. So I come into login required. And that means I've got to do some sort of authentication. So I'm going to do get password, which could, this again, I could connect this to a database. I'm keeping it very simple right here. And then I've got my error handler. So what happens if I'm not authorized? What do I send back? One thing I missed in the initial set of code is all the way back, we created this app, we created an endpoint. The one thing we do need to do is we need to actually have an application. We have to actually run it. So I've got my main set up and I just do an app run. Now I can do it without any parameters and it's going to build it'll be an API that's only accessible 127.0.0.1. But what I've done here is I've actually said I'm going to run it on this IP address, which is my server. And we'll see that. We see that everywhere we make the calls is here's where I run that. Now I didn't specify the port here, so it's just going to by default pick up the 5,000. We can see it here. So where it's running here, it's going to pick up that 5,000. I could also specify that out. There's a few more things we could do with running it, but generally speaking, the only one that's of interest is making sure that we run it on the right host, host address, and potentially if we wanted to tweak the port itself. And make sure I caught what I wanted in the latest. So, and then so we come in for security. Very, very simple. Now, granted, I do have to, add the caveat that in this example, I kept the security as simple as possible. But it would work in the easiest of worlds if you didn't want to worry about, if you wanted to do something to be somewhat a deterrent, is that you could go through each of these and you could give that to customers. So I could say, for every customer, here's a username and here's some password. I could, with the copy and paste of the login required, I could secure each of my endpoints and then say, hey, you have to send, essentially this username and password here in order to be able to use anything. Now, obviously, you can get much more complicated and you can send a token back and have them send that token as part of it. But right now, we're just keeping it simple on the username password security. And so that brings us around to what have we learned? Well, hopefully you've learned that Flask is a pretty powerful framework. In a matter of a couple of minutes, we were able to put together an API, which is like a lot of these things, it's very useful, particularly when you think back to proof of concepts and minimum viable products and things like that. We don't want to spend a lot of time putting together the infrastructure. We want that ideally pretty much set up for us, which is exactly what we get in this situation. And it supports all the common stuff that we would need for an API. We can do gets, we can do posts, we can do puts, we can, we're off and running with that. It supports options by default, so it's going to tell you what's available for that endpoint. And then we've also seen security itself. It's pretty easy for us to put at least some simple security on top of this in a matter of minutes. All of this code we put together, even if you were new to Python and didn't know it too much, through a couple of searches and examples, you could have something like this spun up in no time. I think you could literally take somebody that's a somewhat experienced programmer, sit them down with a tutorial, and have them cranking out API stuff in less than an hour. And there are other tools out there that'll provide similar kinds of frameworks and things like that. But this one, there's so little code that you need and so little that you need to understand that I see this as a great way to spin up an API fast. Which is why I think you're seeing a lot of adoption on that. You don't have to be a seasoned, grizzled veteran to be able to build APIs this way. And so that brings us to questions and comments.
So for your app you were talking about having to do, why wouldn't you do something like this for that then? This looks really clean and straightforward.
What was that? I didn't get the question quite.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So my question is, so for that app you were talking about building, why wouldn't you build the backend, the API with this? Is it just too simple, not enough security, or?
No, that's exactly what I'm thinking of doing. That's exactly the approach I'm going to do. There's another security library that I would most likely use, because the other security that I've seen used before, it's a role-based security. So not only do you authenticate, it's got a lot of built-in pieces so that you authenticate as a certain type of user. And it works, not to get too far off track, but where we have here these methods, basically what it allows would be something like secure, get, and let's say post. And what it would do, it's got two things. It's one, I could say that I could in one call have some of these methods secure and some of them aren't. So it's a little easier to do that. Whereas here, what we're doing here, like I mentioned before, I could handle in one method all three, but this method of security means it would be all or none. I would either be securing all three of them or none of them, or I have to do this route where I split this up. The other thing it allows is that in a given role, only certain methods are allowed. So I would return back, like if you log in and you are a read-only user, then one of the things I could do is say, well, then you're only allowed to do gets. And there's, which is really good if you're consistent in how you do gets and posts and puts. Then you can just say, okay, anything that's a post, maybe only certain people can use it. Anything to put, only certain people use it. Anything that's to delete, only certain people can use it. So it allows a lot more granularity and a lot more comprehensive security approach. But this is, the Flask stuff is exactly what I'm thinking of doing in this little app that I want to, this, I guess not little, but this app that I'll probably be building out, because like I said, the API is so quick and easy to build. And with the ability to, within a command, easily put together JSON results, that's exactly what I'm going to want from a mobile app, because it's really easy to wheel and deal with that JSON content.
That's cool. Yeah, it looks really simple. I'm going to have to kind of play around with this over the next few weeks.
Yeah, other questions and comments? All right, hearing that. And I agree. I mean, that's actually part of what got me down the path of doing this presentation, as I was doing some work, doing some of this kind of work. And it's so easy and powerful. It was hard not to explore it a little more and say, wow, there's probably a lot of stuff I can do here faster and with a lighter weight system than some of the other tools I've used in the past. So, as always, I appreciate the time spent listening, paying attention to this, time spent to think through it, questions. If you have any questions for us, as always, you can get us at info@developerpreneur.com. We've got a contact us form out there as well if you don't want to send an email. At Developerpreneur is our Twitter, and we're still cranking stuff out there on a regular basis. If you want to see links to the latest of any of the content that we've put out, plus just other articles that show up that we found that are of some value to potential anybody that would be a Developerpreneur fan. We've got a YouTube channel out there. I'm not going to go through trying to speak that long link there, but we've got a link to that. You can go out to vimeo.com/developerpreneur and check a lot of our videos out there. The YouTube stuff YouTube and Vimeo are very similar. YouTube is just obvious. I would say obviously more YouTube-ish as you would normally expect from a YouTube video. Whereas Vimeo is much, it's a little more of it's a different viewing experience. But content-wise, they are more or less the same. Vimeo tends to get stuff first, and then YouTube comes later. And of course, we do actually still have a Facebook.com page, facebook.com/developerpreneur, and we put content out there and place for people to gather and throw some information out there as well. We're just going to keep cranking this stuff out with our goal of being able to make every developer better.